All right, hello everyone and good evening. Thank you all for joining us tonight for this opportunity to hear from Shane Phillips about housing policy and how to make cities more affordable. A little bit about Shane's background. He manages the UCLA Lewis Center Housing Initiative, where he develops research, policy, analysis, and educational materials to improve the public's understanding of housing markets and policies. He co-hosts the UCLA Housing Voice podcast and previously taught as an adjunct instructor at USC and worked as a policy director for the Central City Association, a downtown LA advocacy organization. And he's also the author of The Affordable City, which argues for a multi-pronged approach to housing that addresses housing supply, stability, and subsidies. Shane has written for the Los Angeles Times, The Atlantic, and other local and national outlets, and occasionally publishes at his blog, betterinstitutions.com. And with that, I will pass it over to you, Shane.
Thank you, Simon. Let me just share my screen here really quick on the right slide. There we go. I really appreciate the invite, and I'm looking forward to talking for a bit, but also hearing from folks and trying to answer as many questions as I can. I guess I will start this out with kind of the same way I start my book, which is sort of a short case study on a development proposal here in Los Angeles. It goes by the name of Yucca Argyle, based on its cross streets. And it's in Hollywood, just a block or so from Hollywood Boulevard. The proposed project is 200 units, including 40 reserved for low-income households. You're probably familiar with this if you've seen my book at all, because it's right at the beginning, but I'm just going to run through it quick. This is being built on private land with private funding, no subsidies whatsoever. A market rate one bedroom in this neighborhood, in this project, will probably run at a minimum of $2,500 per month. That's just kind of the cost of doing business here in Los Angeles. But those 40 income restricted units, the below market units, would rent for closer to probably $800 or $1,000 a month, depending on their size. That's quite a bit less than what many of the 50 or 70-year-old apartments on the open market in Hollywood rent for. Typical prices for those might be $1,500 a month, $2,000 a month, something like that. And that is important because the project, the 200 unit project, would be replacing one of the older apartment buildings, and a pretty big one, in fact, that was about 40 units. So if you're looking at this from a high level, which frankly is how I would have looked at this project 5 or 6 years ago, this is an objectively good trade. So good project. You're taking 40 rent stabilized units, most of which probably would have rents in the $1,200 to $1,500 a month range, if not more. And you're replacing them one for one with 40 income restricted units renting for under $1,000 a month. And those units are going to be deed restricted to remain affordable for at least 55 years, whereas rent stabilized tenants reset back to market rate when the tenancies turn over. So on top of that, you're getting 160 market rate units, which help absorb growing demand. They stabilize prices, they densify the neighborhood, create tax revenues. It's a few blocks from the subway line in Hollywood, which is good for the environment too. And yet, as this photo shows, the people who lived in this building, the existing building that's being torn down, they put together a really large and effective protest against the project. And as someone who is very pro-housing, I would say that this protest was justified on their part. And I'll explain why. So the problem here arises when we shift our frame from that more citywide or regional level and start looking at individual households. So yes, the rent stabilized units would be replaced by more affordable and longer term below market units, and they're newer and nicer too, and that's a great thing. But it wouldn't be the current tenants who benefited from this. Some would earn too little to be eligible for these units, others would earn too much. And even among those who were eligible, they would be competing with hundreds and probably over 1,000 applicants for those units. And so their odds of getting them were very small. The rent stabilized tenants would be evicted, and they might get a relocation payment of up to $20,000, depending on various household circumstances. But you can do the math on how far that would take you if you're paying $800 a month in a rent stabilized unit. And now you're back on the market where a comparable unit costs you $1,500 a month or more. $20,000, as much as it might sound like it is not adequate compensation for that loss. So of course the tenants are going to oppose this project. They're not NIMBYs for doing so. I think they're actually totally justified because their lives are being made demonstrably worse for someone else's benefit. The fact that the beneficiaries aren't just developers, but also residents of the new building, both market rate and below market, that's not going to convince anyone that they individually should be the ones to bear the price of progress in that way. So my main takeaway from this story is that depending on your perspective, you could see this as a purely bad or a purely good project. And within the confines of that perspective, you might be right. But we can't confine ourselves to one perspective or another in this work. The region-wide benefits absolutely matter, and we have to take them into account. Cities all over the US absolutely need more housing, but those regional benefits can't be the only thing that we concern ourselves with. We need to also be concerned with how individual people and households are affected. So for those focused solely on the tenants, the reverse is also true. The region-wide benefits really matter. We have to look at both and to take both seriously and try to the best of our ability to maximize those regional benefits while minimizing or even eliminating those individual harms. I think we can get so focused on one or the other goal that we end up scaring away a lot of the people who might otherwise be allies. And it's my view that a lack of allies is why a lot of the positive changes that we all claim to want to see are not coming to fruition. So I think a simple way, hopefully not a controversial statement to make here, is that in housing, I think we find ourselves in factions very often. On the one hand, I think the stereotypical pro-housing advocate or YIMBY or whomever sees a project like the Yucca Argyle and they ask the very important question, who benefits? And that's their focus. At the same time, on the other side, you have the stereotypical pro-tenant advocate, the tenant union member, and so forth, who sees this project and asks who is harmed. And that's also a really important question. And the message of my book, and really a through line for my advocacy and my research, is that we all need to start asking both of these questions, and that when we do that, better policy and stronger partnerships, as I talked about, will follow from that. So quickly, I think people are familiar with the book, so I won't spend a lot of time on this. I'll just say the book is sort of broken up into two sections. The first is sort of an argument for the 3 S's: supply, stability, and subsidy, and we'll get into that. And the second part is actually getting into the details on what that policy, how you would advance those 3 priorities. What specific policies can get you more supply, what specific policies can get you more stability, and so forth, and how those fit together. It's more of a handbook than anything, and something that, because housing is so complicated and there's so many things to keep track of, I actually still reference the book myself, at least the table of contents occasionally, just to remind myself of certain policies that kind of fall off the radar here and there. So I hope it's useful to others in that same way. So I said my framework for thinking about this is the 3 S's: supply, stability, and subsidy. Another frame I'm sure many of you have heard is the 3 P's, which is production, protection, and preservation. The overall message is very similar. Broadly, this just means building enough homes for everyone who needs one, protecting renters and other vulnerable households in their homes and in their communities, and providing adequate funding for the gaps left where supply policies and stability policies just aren't going to do enough by themselves. Each of these goals really serves a different purpose, and each has to be a priority for different reasons. And I think it's important to acknowledge, and we'll kind of get to this in a bit, that each can be in tension with the others, especially when it's pursued in isolation without thinking about those other priorities. Like when we focus on increasing subsidies without addressing supply, or we focus on increasing supply without thinking about the impacts to individual household stability, like with the Yucca Argyle, for example. And I want to be clear here that this is, for me, both a political and a policy statement, because I don't think we will build those coalitions that I talked about if renters, if young people, if communities of color, if low-income households, and many others feel, I think sometimes justifiably, that change is a threat to them. And right now it can be. So starting off here with supply, I'm gonna, again, if folks are familiar with the book, some of this will be not new to you, but I'm really trying to always think about how to frame these things in ways that you yourself can take to your own, colleagues and community and sort of make this case to them directly. So again, starting with supply, why this matters. The short answer is that we've been building less and less housing over the decades, and we've got a worsening shortage that's causing housing prices to rise. You can see in this chart of national housing starts that there are lots of ups and downs over the years, but we have a pretty clear, steady downward trend. And if you adjust this for population, which this is not, it looks a lot worse. We had more than 100 million fewer people. Population of the US is around 200 million in the 70s. Now it's 340 million, and we're building less housing than we did back then. One thing I want to draw your attention to is these red lines, the two sections between them. From 1993 to 2007, our worst year of home building saw the start of 1.29 million homes. Over the next decade, from 2008 to 2018, our best home building year was only 1.25 million homes. That's 400,000 less. So our best home building year of the past decade was worse than our worst home building year of the previous decade. You can see at the very tail there, we've been doing a little better recently, but we have many, many years of historic levels of underproduction to make up for. And again, as you're all aware, rising rates, supply chain issues, all kinds of things are making it harder to continue building at the rate we have been in the last few years. Here's just another way of looking at that, almost the same exact time period, actually. So per capita housing permits issued 1990 to 2007 are in orange, and for 2008 to 2018 in green. Every single metro area is building less. And you can see here, Minneapolis right there. It is right there in the middle with the best of them. Much, much less, maybe, what is that? Half or so, a little less than half of what it was building prior to the Great Recession per capita. And I pulled this for Minneapolis and St. Paul, but this trend looks the same anywhere you go. It's like shockingly consistent. This matters because places that build more homes have higher vacancy rates, and places with higher vacancy rates have slower rent growth, meaning they stay affordable longer. You can see it here for the Twin Cities, and you can see it all over. The points of lowest vacancy correspond to the highest year-over-year rent increases, and the years with the highest vacancy correspond to the lowest annual rent increases. One more set of charts here. What we see from really an overwhelming and always growing amount of evidence, including these charts, is that places that build more see their home prices rise more slowly, and they experience less displacement in most cases. The left chart here compares rents in coastal California, where very little has been built over the past 40 years, to the US counties that have built the most housing. And as you can see, the growth in those latter counties has been much slower. The chart on the right shows, it actually compares displacement in places that build a small amount of housing in dark blue, and this is specifically market rate housing, to places that build a lot in light blue. And here again, we see much better outcomes in the high production areas. And it's basically true whether a city has inclusionary zoning or not, which is the two different sets there. Putting aside all of this data, I think it's useful just to think about this sort of rationally or logically. As a Californian, I always hate to give Texas credit, but compare Los Angeles and San Francisco to Houston or Dallas. All of these cities have really dynamic, growing economies. There's clearly a ton of demand to live in all of them. And yet LA and San Francisco have much higher housing prices and far, far more homelessness. I'm not here to convince people to like developers. It's kind of beside the point to me, but it is important because how we treat developers is important, how we see them, because the diverging fates of California and Texas make it very clear to me that developers can't be the cause of this crisis, as a lot of people would like us to believe. We can ask, are LA and San Francisco more friendly to developers? No. Do they spend less on affordable housing? Definitely not. Do they care less about vulnerable people and groups? I don't think they do. And I also don't think that Dallas and Houston just managed to get lucky and attract a bunch of benevolent developers that don't care about profits. And yet here we are. So what really distinguishes these places is that Dallas and Houston build 2 or 3 times more housing per capita than LA and San Francisco. And you could look overseas to somewhere like Tokyo, which is building 5 times more housing per capita than California. And it's one of the most affordable mega cities in the world. So we see these trends all over the place. They're very consistent. And even when it's market rate housing, it is doing a lot of good for us. So I want to sort of summarize this here, and I'll do this for each of them. All of the others won't take so much to lead up to. Supply for me is about acknowledging that there are physical and economic constraints in the housing market that we have to actually take seriously. First, people need homes. And if more people want to move to a place, and if they have the money to do so, no amount of wishing otherwise will keep them out. And of course, that shouldn't be our goal anyway. You can't solve the issues caused by increasing demand and increasing population only by redistributing what you've already got. You have to build more. On the economic side, scarcity empowers landlords at the expense of tenants and sellers at the expense of home buyers. Growing demand for a city, I think, is good. It's a great sign that your city is a place that people want to live. But we want that demand to manifest as increased production and availability of housing and all the choice and amenities that come with that, not just rising prices on a fixed supply of homes. For each of these 3 S's, I think it's really important to acknowledge what they can and cannot do, because none of these can do it all by themselves. So supply, for me, is really about building a better future. It can stabilize prices and create new amenities and tax revenues. As I've said, it can help meet sustainability goals and build up our economies. And again, at a fundamental level, we all need housing to live in. But it operates slowly. It doesn't produce immediate results. It's imprecise in where housing ends up, especially when we rely on the market. And it's not going to turn a very expensive city into a very affordable city. Markets just don't really work that way usually. They don't go dramatically backward in prices, except in really dire circumstances, which is a really good argument for not letting things get too bad, because it is much harder to solve affordability problems when your median home price is $350,000 than when it's $1 million, as it is in much of California. So supply is absolutely essential, but it isn't enough by itself. And as the Yucca Argyle case, I think, demonstrates, it can also be accompanied by harms that we have to take seriously. So one last thing here on supply, I think an analogy is useful. In the past 2 years, used car prices have shot up by 50%, from an average of $20,000 in January of 2020 to $30,000 today. For a bunch of reasons, we've seen a shortfall in the production of cars, new cars, which also saw their prices rise as a result. And the impacts of that very quickly cascaded down to the used car market. Now, the fact is that cars don't last as long as homes, and people cycle through cars more frequently than they do homes. So we would expect a shortfall in production of cars to affect prices faster than with homes. Many more people buy cars in any given year. But it only took months for used car prices to climb by about 15% and 2 years to get to this 50% increase. In much of the US, we have been underbuilding housing for over 40 years. And so I think that should give some idea just for how deep a hole we have dug ourselves into and how far we have to go to climb out of it. So really quickly, these and many other things are in the book, so I won't dwell on them, and I'm happy to talk about them after, but just some quick examples of this on the supply side specifically. One option here is building up your commercial corridors and centers where you have really good transit, or at least better transit, and where you're much less likely to displace existing tenants. This is not to say that commercial corridors and centers should be your only housing strategy, but they're a good starting point, or a good part of a broader strategy. Also on the zoning side, I think it's really important, and I've written a little bit about this, to zone across a wide swath of the city to allow more housing in many areas all at once, to not concentrate it all in one place at very high densities. The concentration will push up land prices faster, which makes it more expensive to build affordably. And it will force you to build at densities that have higher costs. So, if you're over 8 feet, usually or 8 stories, you're going to be building with concrete or steel versus smaller buildings you can do mostly with wood. And the cost of that is much lower. And so there is value both on the land side and the actual construction side to spreading it around and getting that sort of missing middle density in a lot of places at once, even though most parcels are not going to turn over and not going to be redeveloped anytime soon. Allowing them to be can really make a difference. One thing I'm always talking about, and we actually have a research paper coming out in the Journal of the American Planning Association hopefully soon on this, is making more developments approvals by right, increasing the certainty and lowering the cost of getting a project approved in the first place, and really removing discretion to the greatest extent possible. I'm coming from Los Angeles, where we have one of our council members is currently in jail. Another is almost certainly on his way. A third is probably not going to jail, but you never know. He's caught up in some things, all related to development approvals. Inserting this kind of discretion into the process, it breeds corruption on the one hand, and even when corruption is not existent, it gives the appearance of corruption because people see that, developers show up, they ask for something that does not comply with the rules. And as long as they give some kind of benefit to the city and maybe to the city council member, they get their approval. So it breeds a distrust in the process. And we really need to have a rule of law in our approvals, basically, where we agree on a plan, we say what can be built, and then if someone shows up and says, I would like to build what it says can be built, they just get to do it. And there's no haggling over it. And finally, of course, reducing and eliminating parking minimums. I think this has happened a little bit in your neck of the woods already, but it really does make a big difference, not just on the sustainability side, but on the cost side as well, reducing both the price and the time it takes to build new housing. So moving on to stability here, I try to start this off with sort of some questions. I came to housing policy with an emphasis on supply, and especially in high cost cities, I have zero doubt that underproduction is the most important problem that we need to solve, even if it's not enough to fix the problems by itself. But the longer I work in this field, and the more I talk to people about housing and hear people's stories and give presentations like this, the stronger I feel about the role of stability. So again, I think it's worth asking some questions. One is just, what do cities and towns have to offer the large number of households who rent? As I see it, in most places, all that renters have to look forward to is rising rents restricted only by what the market will bear, the possibility of eviction at any time for any reason or no reason, no prospects for wealth creation, and a diminishing chance of escape into homeownership as prices rise, both on the rent side so they can't save, and on the ownership side so they can't get a mortgage or afford a down payment. So I think it's, another way of putting this, asking this question is, do renters have the same moral worth as homeowners, or are they second-class citizens who only gain their full rights through the acquisition of real estate? I think we know the answer to these questions as they stand today, and I don't think we should feel good about it. I also know that I'm speaking to a group that is primed to see homeownership as a wonderful and enriching thing, and it absolutely can be. I own my house. I actually own a duplex and have a below-market tenant in the other unit. But homeownership should be something that stands on its own 2 feet, not something that relies on making renting such a terrible experience that ownership only looks great by comparison. If homeownership is great, and again, I think it really can be for many people, it should be enough by itself. And I just don't think we can accept anymore the way things have gone for renters and the way that we've treated them, for the basic reason that everyone deserves some basic measure of security and predictability in their lives. And that especially should be true when it comes to something as important as your home. Ownership shouldn't be the price of that security. Being a human being should be. I also want to say that as a researcher, absolutely nothing I have learned about housing policy indicates to me that treating renters like crap is a precondition for housing affordability. There are absolutely tensions between tenant protections and housing supply and affordability. I will never deny that. But we often use the need to build homes as an excuse to oppose tenant protections, despite the fact that there are cities all over the world that combine stronger tenant protections than you see in almost any city in the US, with much more home building than we see here. So again, kind of summarizing this a little bit, for me, I think, if supply is about these economic and physical realities, stability is about the fact that we have moral obligations and we need to live up to them. A person shouldn't lose their home simply because they have the, I did want to say that stability policies are important and affordability is important, and stability can further that, but also just having some sense of security, peace of mind, predictability is really, really overlooked. And I think especially homeowners don't appreciate how different it is to not know if you'll be able to live in the same home 2 years from now, even if you do everything right. So I think ultimately a person should not lose their home simply because they happen to live in a neighborhood or in a city that's suddenly gentrifying. And the corollary to that is that a property owner shouldn't be able to claim all of that upside if their property happens to be in a gentrifying neighborhood. That's especially true for landlords whose returns on investment are directly inversely proportional to how badly their tenants are getting hosed in the housing market. That's not to put any blame on anyone, but I do think it's important to acknowledge. And whether implicit or explicit, I think there's a belief that when home values go up, that's because the property owner made a smart investment. But we all know, I hope no one will deny this, that luck plays such a big role in all of this. The person who bought their home in Cleveland as a teacher, say, in 1970 versus the same person taking a teaching job in Palo Alto that same year, the latter person did not make a better decision. They just got lucky. And now they're a millionaire and the other person has nothing in terms of home equity. And there's something wrong there, something that we need to take efforts to address. And we're not going to get it all done anytime soon, but we can't just pretend like that's fair and just accept that that's the way things are. As my colleague Mike Manville once put it, that home in the Hollywood Hills didn't quadruple in value over a 20-year period because the owner did a killer kitchen remodel. It's a much bigger community-wide, society-wide effect. And if society is the reason, if your community as a whole is the reason that property values have gone up so much where you live, then maybe something is owed back to them. And again, I'll say, I am a landlord, so I'm not saying expropriate everyone. I'm not saying people shouldn't earn any money, but there needs to be some kind of balance here. So again, what these can and can't do, stability policies can and do protect millions of households here in the US and all over the world. They shield them from rising rents, from illegitimate evictions. But I think it's important to acknowledge that they don't actually make things more affordable. They don't make things better. They can't actively improve things. They just keep things from getting worse as rapidly. And that's absolutely important. That's an important goal, but it's why stabilizing policies by themselves are not enough either. The fact that things like tenant protections don't actually make things better isn't a problem. The problem is when we enact them thinking that it's going to solve the underlying issue, which they can't do. So quickly here on some stabilizing policies. I'm a pretty big advocate for rent stabilizing older housing. I'll add some caveats to that because how you design it really matters, but I'll do that in a few slides from now. I think limiting low yield developments through various means. So, the cases where you tear down a 5-unit apartment and replace it with a 3-unit apartment or condo, that's just bad. And it happens more than it should. And we should have protections in place to protect against that, at the very least to, well, I guess the next bullet here kind of gets at that, is to have some kind of compensation for people who are displaced in these kinds of circumstances. And that will tend to push against these downsizing or only marginal increases. Because if you have to offer a unit in the new building to the old tenants, it's not going to make sense to only replace 1-for-1 or 1.5-for-1 and so on. These are all things that are possible, but get a lot easier actually when you have the supply policies in place at the same time. So subsidies, I'll be really quick here. Subsidies are a tool to apply where supply and stability policies fall short. This can be everything from federal housing vouchers and tax credits for below market construction, all the way down to local versions of similar programs and other kinds of things. I think almost as important as how we spend subsidies and taking care to spend them efficiently is also how we raise revenues for them. Not just to generate as much funding as possible as your city or state might need or want, but also because well-designed taxes and fees can also serve other important goals like reducing housing speculation and encouraging housing production, and poorly designed taxes and fees can actually discourage these things. So again, what they can do, what they cannot do, help a ton of people with their housing needs, most of whom just wouldn't be able to get by all that well without some kind of support. But they just can't help everyone. And I don't think that's fully appreciated, how expensive and futile it would be to try to subsidize everyone's housing costs below 80% of area median income, for example. The problem is when we fail to provide enough supply to keep and fail to keep people stably housed with some kind of stabilizing policies, the number of people who need assistance grows and the cost of helping each person increases as well. So without the right supply and stability policies, subsidies can just keep growing and growing without ever actually seeing better outcomes. And here in Los Angeles, where we're now spending $500,000 or $600,000 per unit on a below market housing unit for a 1-bedroom for a formerly homeless person, this is a pretty good illustration of how bad things can get. Up in San Francisco, it's closer to $1 million per unit these days, and that's not sustainable. So I like to think of this as the 3 S's as a sort of 3-legged stool. And if you're not familiar with the metaphor, this is just something that's sturdy, resilient when all 3 legs are in place, but you kick just one out and the whole thing topples right over. So on the supply side, supply without stability, I think, can mean unnecessary displacement and disruption. And without subsidy, it can mean that poor households are just going to be left behind. Stability without supply or without subsidy is ultimately just managed decline, not progress. As I said, you have to have supply and often subsidies to make things actively better. And then subsidy without supply is really just going to produce a black hole of rising costs as you just pump a larger and larger amount of money into a relatively fixed supply of homes, and the current owners of those homes mostly are the ones to benefit. And then subsidy without stability is going to leave a lot of people needing assistance who might not have needed it otherwise if they could have stayed in their homes or if their rents hadn't gone up quite so fast. Another way that I think about this is that focusing only on supply is a recipe for concentrated harms and diffuse benefits. This is also, I think, the story of American manufacturing, where by offshoring production, we're able to save a ton of money on new clothes and televisions and all kinds of great things. But the cost was all of the people who lost their middle-class jobs and never found anything to completely make up for that. The aggregate savings on all those things that are being made overseas, the savings to consumers certainly exceeds the losses to those individual workers. But again, that is no comfort to those individual workers. We have to find ways to mitigate those downsides of progress, not to stop them, but to find something, in the case of manufacturing, to do for those workers, in the case of housing, to do for people who might be facing displacement, for example. People deserve some some basic dignity and security, especially in their housing. And if they don't have it, they're going to fear change. On the stability side, I think focusing only on stability, and unfortunately we see this way too often, is engaging in this scarcity mindset. And the reality is you cannot redistribute your way out of a housing shortage. It is true that we have a distribution problem with housing, just as we have a problem with supply. But I think, maybe just because so many other issues in America do come down to, wealth and income inequality, there's a belief that housing must be the same. But the truth is that we have both a redistribution or inequality problem in housing, and we have a quantity or supply problem, and we have to address both. One or the other isn't going to cut it. So just some quick examples on how this stuff links together a little bit. Let's say you're considering rent stabilization, which I hear St. Paul has done recently and made some bad choices, perhaps. If you're considering this, though, how should you design it? I think if you only care about stability, and again, I think the recent ballot initiative might describe it pretty well, you could cap rent increases on every single rental unit, including new ones, and keep those caps even between tenancies. The result, which we've seen all across the world when you do these things, is that new development will be much riskier, and rents on existing units will fall relative to the cost of operating them, and you'll end up with fewer homes getting built and many apartments getting converted into condos. So now you've got low rents on many of your units, but you've got fewer of those units every year, and the ones that become available probably aren't going to be going to the people with the greatest need. Instead, they're going to go to family friends. They're going to go to people willing to pay key money. They're going to go to small households that don't have kids because the landlords think that larger households might cause more damage to the unit. In some sense, this kind of approach is just trading one kind of decline for another. Instead of prices rising too quickly, which is bad, we've got a dwindling stock of poorly maintained homes. And I think we can do better than that. And as you might guess, I don't think it's inevitable that those outcomes come to pass. Suppose instead that you take supply into account when you're thinking about the stabilizing policy of rent stabilization. You could design the policy to do some very basic things, exempt new buildings for their first 20 years, for example, and allow rents to reset to market rate when units turn over. The result from this is tenants in older, more affordable units will still have that security and predictability, but homes continue to get built because they can still make their profits in that first 20 years, which is really what matters. And fewer rentals get converted to owner occupancy because eventually the tenants move out, you'll be able to go back to market rate and things will be just fine. This isn't the maximal approach where every existing tenant gets everything they could possibly want, but it's balancing short-term and long-term interests and providing security to the people who need it most, which should be our priority. These kinds of simple fixes are everywhere in housing policy when we are willing to take on some sacred cows. There's just one more example here. Say you're considering upzoning. One very aggressive strategy could be to just upzone everything and do so significantly. Let's say you allow 10 units on every parcel, and putting aside how revolutionary this would be in the US context and all the benefits that would come from it, you would certainly see a lot of new housing. I think the vast majority of it would go to high income neighborhoods rather than low income because construction markets are regional. And why would you build in a neighborhood with low rents when you could build for basically the same cost minus land in places with higher rent? But there is no doubt that there would also be a lot of displacement. Not all the housing is going to be in these high income neighborhoods or in places where they're previously owner occupied or not residential at all. A lot of people are going to lose their homes and there's not, by this proposal, there's no compensation for that really. But again, that is not necessary in the same way that rent stabilization does not have to decimate the rental housing supply if it's designed properly. Neither do supply forward policies need to be harmful to tenants. So I propose that at the same time we change our zoning to accommodate more homes, we also enact strong displacement mitigations like right to return, which I'll talk about a little bit, that achieve two things. First, they ensure that if and when tenants are displaced, they're adequately compensated, if not better off. Right of return basically says that if you are kicked out for a redevelopment, you can come back into the new building in a similar unit at your previous rent and have that kind of locked in. And obviously there's a cost to that, but the more you upzone, the easier that cost is to bear. Second, most development in this circumstance will not happen where tenants live because it's cheaper to tear down places where tenants don't live and build there first. Maybe in the future, it will make sense to evict tenants and tear down a duplex and build 10 units, say, but first you're going to find that a lot of the interest goes toward single family neighborhoods where the owner is voluntarily leaving, or formerly commercial or industrial properties and things like that. So I want to note that this also works in reverse. If we just enacted these strong protections, but left the zoning untouched, suddenly you're going to have fewer sites that are feasible for redevelopment and nothing to offset that loss. So you may be protecting tenants from displacement, and that's good, but you're also doing long-term harm to your housing supply, which is both bad and unnecessary. So I had never heard this phrase until a couple of years ago. It's attributed to Dwight Eisenhower, former president, but probably apocryphally. But the line is, if you can't solve a problem, enlarge it. And I'll kind of explain what that means. Housing is very complex, and any single action you take is likely to have both positive and negative outcomes. But if you can enlarge the problem, zoom out from the thing you're focused on and address that issue, but also the unintended consequences of that solution, consequences that may not be intended, but are usually predictable, and try to address both of those things at the same time. So just, to make this connection obvious, if you want to solve the problem of supply, enlarge it to include stability and subsidy and address your critics. And likewise, if you want to solve the problem of stability, take supply and subsidy, et cetera. We see this kind of, another word for this is bundling. We see it all over the place. It's how Congress solved the problem, I don't know if this was more than a decade ago, multiple decades ago, of deciding which US military bases to close. They couldn't decide on each base closure individually, so they bundled them together so that many different places had to feel the pain all at once, and none could really feel totally singled out. Another example here, closer to home for me, is California cities, because of a law from 20 years ago, have been shifting from at-large city council elections to district elections. And some recent research has shown that cities with district elections approve less housing. And that's obviously bad, but the representational benefits of district elections in terms of racial and ethnic minorities are really important and very clear from these kinds of elections. So the solution can't be to just get rid of those elections and go back to at-large and have these cities that are like 40% Latino, but represented by 5 white dudes. The solution is to enlarge the problem. In the case of California, we're doing that by having the state step in and set some basic ground rules for housing so that cities can't be so obstinate and can't just stand completely in the way of production and do even worse when they switch to district elections. That's things like, I'm sure some things you've heard, like we have ADU laws that passed 5 years ago, and we've kind of improved them over time, building a ton of ADUs these days. We just passed a bill called SB9, where we're allowing lot splits and duplexes on each lot now. That's kind of moving slowly, but we'll see how it goes. But these are just examples of bundling or enlarging the problem that I think can be really useful. A few more slides here to close this out. They're a bit of a departure, but I think they're messages that you may find useful in your own work and advocacy. So I'll leave you with them. First, I always like to share this quote by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court from 1965. It's about a zoning case, but you could easily replace the word zoning with housing or urban planning, and then I think it would be just as applicable. This quote is, "Zoning is a means by which a governmental body can plan for the future. It may not be used to deny the future, to avoid the increased responsibilities and economic burdens which time and natural growth invariably bring." So you cannot deny the future. And I think where a lot of places in this country have gone wrong is thinking that they could. But as I see it, there's no such thing as no growth, which is sort of the mindset that I'm talking about here. There's no denying the future. Cities all along the coasts and in many other parts of the country have tried this, and we are seeing the results. It doesn't work. Ultimately, over the medium and long term, I think there are really just three futures for every city. One is you can grow your housing stock to accommodate rising demand, a lot of which might just be children being born and growing up in your city. It's not all about accommodating people from somewhere else. You can not build housing, and that rising demand will instead manifest as rising prices and all the problems that come with that. Or you're just a place that people don't want to live, and you're probably already stagnating, and eventually you're going to fall into decline. Given the choice between these three options, and I really do think this is what it comes down to in the long run, number one is the obvious pick, and it has the most potential to leave our kids and grandkids and just future generations, whether they're our relations or not, better off rather than worse. I think another way of putting this, which I'm trying out here recently, is this image on the right. So you can have a city that is appealing, affordable, or unchanging, but you have to pick two. If it's appealing and unchanging, it's not going to be affordable. So you can think somewhere like San Francisco. If it's unchanging and affordable, that's because it's not appealing. So think many Rust Belt cities, for example, where they're at right now. If it's appealing and affordable, it's not going to stay that way for long if you don't build homes and plan for a future with more neighbors. And I think that's where a lot of cities should be, but are not taking that trade-off seriously. And they're hoping that if they can just bury their heads in the sand, everything will turn out fine. So last, I do think it's important to think about housing in a positive way, not just as a, as a burden, as a thing where people need to eat their vegetables and accept more homes. I want people to think about the opportunities we all face in our cities and towns, and not just the burdens. That Supreme Court opinion talked about denying the future and avoiding the responsibilities and economic burdens that come with growth. And I can understand where that comes from, but I do think it's really wrong. I think there are so many parts of this country and the world that would give anything to have the problem of deciding how to manage demand. To be popular and in demand is a blessing, and we shouldn't waste it. I think what we need to do instead is envision a better future that does accommodate more people, and like be excited, be happy that all we have to do to make other people's lives better is to make some space for them. Again, not many people have such an opportunity, such an easy way to make other people's lives so much better. Tying this back to the three S's and the tensions between them, I think it's really important to listen to your critics and the people who say, hey, that policy you're pitching is going to harm me or the people I care about in some way. Understand that just because you don't value something doesn't mean it's unimportant. And from that, build the coalitions that you'll need to make the shared vision into a reality. So I will close it there. Sorry, I feel like that went longer than I expected, but you have my contact information here. I would also encourage anyone who's interested to check out our podcast. Every 2 weeks, we do a new episode on some kind of research and try to kind of communicate it in normal human, non-academic language as much as we can. We covered everything from parking reform to Japanese housing policy to the abolition of single-family zoning in Minneapolis, actually, in episode 10, I think. So feel free to check that out, and thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. We do have a few questions if you have time here for the last 10 minutes or so. And if you think of any questions, feel free to throw them in the chat here. But the first one we have was from the beginning of your presentation. The question is, how many former tenants were displaced by the Yucca Argyle development?
Interestingly, I'm not even sure that project has started construction yet. Okay. I started writing about it. I wrote a blog post about it in 2015, I think, maybe 2016. And it was like in process then. It's actually an interesting project because, the developer didn't try to just kind of like steamroll the residents. They tried to negotiate in good faith, and they've come to like some multiple agreements actually that have sort of changed over time. But I do believe the plan is for any tenant who wants to be able to move back into their previous rent. And the trade-off was like, we're going to actually provide fewer long-term below market units, but in exchange, we're going to make sure that the people who live here now are taken care of. And I think it's a difficult trade to make, but I think it's probably the right one to make in the long run. And if we could do more things like that, we'd probably have a lot more people on board with these kinds of changes.
The next question we have is, how much of the federal budget was devoted to housing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s versus today?
I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but it was more for sure, especially adjusted for inflation. The figure in my book, and this is I think it's a little apples to oranges, but back in, I think the 70s, there were about 300,000 units per year that were built, that were subsidized in some way through the federal government. I'm not sure if that all was like through grants and credits and that kind of thing, or some of it was just like, a really favorable depreciation schedule or something like that. But today we're building about 100,000 a year with the low income housing tax credit program. And that's the vast majority of the units that are being built. So we're doing a lot less than we have before. And I'm definitely a big advocate of, even if, we definitely need to build more homes, we should also, expand the housing voucher program, which only serves a quarter of the people eligible. There's lots of things that the federal government should be doing that is not today, or it's kind of pulled back on its responsibilities.
Another question we have is, how does the creation of good paying jobs fit into the affordable housing equation?
So, I feel like St. Paul is, I'm far from an expert, but I feel like the Twin Cities generally are pretty economically healthy, doing pretty well overall. I realize there's like probably a fair amount of segregation and poverty at the same time. But like overall, I think it's probably fair to say that your problem is more high prices than bad jobs. But this is a real difference or distinction, is that, in the coasts and maybe in the Twin Cities to some extent too, the problem is more the price of housing. And in other places, like the price of housing is too high. In other places, the problem is that incomes are too low. And so, I don't know exactly where your city is at there, but, I just think about like somewhere like San Francisco or the Bay Area generally, how many amazing jobs are there and just how much money is being made. And they're treating it like it's a disaster, like it's a catastrophe. And in some ways it is, because they didn't build housing. And so you've got these like, boring 1,500 square foot single family detached homes in Palo Alto selling for $2.5 million and just like totally immiserating, current and future generations. And they're spending tons of money on affordable housing because it costs $1 million a unit, and homelessness is so bad, and they're spending all this money on that. And it's like, if you had just built homes, you would still have all these amazing jobs and all the tax revenues and everything that come with that. And you'd actually be able to use it on like making things better rather than just fixing all the problems that you've caused by not building the homes. So kind of a departure there, I realized, but I do feel like, if you got good jobs, like take them, but you have to actually do something on the housing side. It can't just be, we'll take your jobs and then, someone else will solve the housing problem, because it's going to come back to bite you eventually, as it is in many places.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. A question I have for you is, you mentioned, I can't remember if it was specifically LA or California generally, that a lot of ADUs are being built.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been an effort in St. Paul to try and expand the building of ADUs that has not been very successful. I think it's been a few years now and 6 have been built. So, is there anything specific that LA or California is doing that maybe we should consider doing in St. Paul to try and increase that?
I wonder if I can find this really quick. So the AARP has a guide that I would just recommend. I'm just going to share in the chat here. Also, Salem Firth and maybe someone else at Mercatus wrote something that draws on this as well. But the key points are, there's like a few things that are important to do. And I think Minneapolis's triplex zoning bill suffers from probably the same problems that St. Paul's ADU law does, in that it's just got so many, you know, I'm sure they weren't thought of this way, but they're poison pills, basically. You know, things like the owner has to live in them or stay in the unit. You have to provide a bunch of parking that like there's no room for. Fees are unrestricted, so you know the cost is just prohibitive, or utilities are an issue. So there's all these different things. There's 4 points that are in the AARP guide, I think, of like a model ordinance, and that addresses most of them. But that's really the key, is like you can't have these owner occupancy requirements. You can't require any parking ideally, but certainly not a bunch of it. And you have to limit the fees. There's one other, but those things will get you a long way. It just has to be easy ultimately. And the nice thing about ADUs and, you know, a triplex bill could work this way. Unless you're going to tear down like a single family home and build 8 units, 10 units, or if it's like really decrepit and it's got to be rebuilt anyway, then you might make sense to build 2 or 4 or something. But generally, it just doesn't make sense to tear down a home to build like 3. If that home is perfectly in good quality right now. ADUs are nice, and you can do more than 1 unit with this because you don't have to tear down the existing use. You just add it to what's already there, and the people who live in the unit can continue to live there, and maybe it's just like extra revenue for them. It's a hassle, it's some construction for a while, but like it's not totally upending people's lives. There's no land costs because you already own the land. There's lots of benefits to that approach if all you feel like you need is the incremental, even if the incremental is probably not the only thing that a city like St. Paul needs.
Right, right. So the last question we have here in the chat, and I guess we can get you out of here on this, is there any talk on running out of space? Like, we only have so much land. Is there any conversations in the housing world about there's actually not enough physical space for some of this building, some of this supply?
I mean, it's always a conversation, but my answer to that is it's true. Land is limited, and we are not creating a whole lot more of it, but there's a whole lot of sky, and so you can always build up. And I am quite certain that St. Paul has a lot of land that is the land itself is undeveloped, and you know the home takes up 20% or 30% of the lot. And that's not to say that we just need to pave over everything. But certainly, you know, in the reality is like density allows you to have a lot of open space, because rather than just spread the homes all out on the land, you can build them up into the air and sort of preserve some of that street space or park space or whatever. It's just a matter of actually making that a priority. And historically it hasn't been. And so I don't want to pretend like it's this easy thing to do. But it's certainly possible. I mean, New York has Central Park. It's got to be the most valuable land on the planet, pretty much, and yet it's right there. And part of what makes it so great is that it's surrounded by millions of people that make it lively and make it active and make it safe to walk around in because there's other people watching. And so I think, you know, not proposing that everywhere needs to become Manhattan, although we could probably use a couple more, but maybe, you know, 1 step or 2 in that direction would be not a big deal.
Well, Shane, thank you so much again for your time and your expertise. We're so appreciative. And then thank you to everyone who took the time out of their evenings to attend this webinar this evening. And everyone have a good evening.
Yeah,
thanks, Shane.
Thanks for having me. Take care.